The wind carries the smell of felt and wood smoke across the Mongolian steppe in the year 1206. Inside a gur, a woman unrolls a marriage contract. Her name is written beside her husband's. Under the law of Temujin, now Genghis Khan, she owns the dowry and the herds outright. If her husband dies, she inherits. If he divorces her without cause, she keeps everything. But 1,000 miles to the west, the same legal system that protects her signature is being enforced by men who have just breached the walls of a city called Urgench. It is the year 1221. The smoke over Urgench is darker, thicker, and carries the smell of burning silk and human fat. The siege has lasted 7 days. The defenders fought room to room. Now the Mongols are moving systematically, street by street, and the Yassa, the great code of laws dictated by Genghis Khan, prescribes the penalty for resistance. Every surviving man is executed. The women and children are divided among the army as spoils. In the same decade, the same legal framework gives a widow in a felt tent the right to refuse remarriage and send a thief to the Yassa's court. How can the same system produce two outcomes so opposite, so violently incompatible, that they seem to belong to different worlds? That is the paradox sitting at the heart of the Mongol Empire, and it is a paradox that most history textbooks quietly skip past, because to explain it is to understand something uncomfortable about how power actually works, and about the quiet trade-offs that every civilization makes between efficiency and humanity. That is the kind of paradox that keeps a historian up at night, a single code producing both a widow's protection and a city's annihilation. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden trade-offs that empires bury beneath their official stories, subscribe to this channel. And tell me in the comments, what historical contradiction have you found that refuses to fit the neat textbook version? A standard education on the Mongol Empire typically opens with a number. The death toll of the entire campaign era is often cited around 40 million, or a reduction of the global population by roughly 1/10. The textbook will then list the destroyed cities: Nishapur, Merv, Ray, Baghdad, each with its own casualty figure that climbs into the hundreds of thousands. Genghis Khan is presented as a force of nature, an agent of annihilation, whose legacy is written in ash and depopulated river valleys. This is not incorrect. It is simply incomplete. Here is what the books rarely mention. The same Yassa code that authorized the sack of Urgench also criminalized the theft of livestock, to the point that a first offense carried 47 lashes with a specific kind of whip, made from oxhide, measured and weighted according to a fixed standard. The same legal system that divided women as spoils of war simultaneously guaranteed a widow the right to manage her late husband's estate, to represent her household in legal disputes, and to pass property to her daughters if no male heir existed. And here is the detail that doesn't fit. There were women who served on the Yassa's courts as witnesses and, in some recorded cases, as adjudicators in property disputes that involved men who were not their relatives. The anomaly becomes a crack in the standard narrative the moment you ask a simple question. Why would a military empire built on conquest, slavery, and systematic terror invest any legal energy at all in protecting women's property rights and granting widows economic autonomy? The Mongols didn't do charity. They didn't do abstract justice. Everything in the imperial structure was calculated for output. Every law in the Yassa served a strategic purpose, or it did not survive. The answer begins in the treeless grasslands of the eastern steppe, centuries before Temujin united the tribes. In that environment, a herder family could survive only if everyone worked. Women managed the herds during the long winter months, when men were away hunting or raiding. Women negotiated trade with neighboring clans at seasonal gatherings. Women memorized the genealogies that governed marriage alliances, and those genealogies were the only form of insurance a family had. A widow who could not inherit was a widow who became a burden. A widow who could not remarry freely was a widow who drained resources from a clan already stretched thin by the climate. The steppe traditions that Genghis inherited did not grant women rights because of any philosophical commitment to equality. They granted those rights because a society that let its widows starve was a society that wasted trained labor and broke bloodlines. The Yassa did not invent these protections. It codified them, standardized them, and made them enforceable across a territory that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. The same cold rationality that calculated that rebellions must be punished by total annihilation also calculated that a widow's property rights were a matter of military readiness. Every herd she kept was a herd that fed the imperial cavalry. Now consider this. The Mongol army that burned Urgench was itself fed and supplied by a logistical system that depended on women managing the home pastures. The bows that archers drew were made from horn, sinew, and birch, materials processed by women in camp settlements that moved with the army. The felt for the gurs, the winter coats, the horse tack, all of it was produced by the same women whose economic independence the Yassa protected. To strip them of property rights would have been to degrade the entire military supply chain, and the empire could not afford that. The forgotten principle emerges clearly now. The protection of women under Mongol law was not a byproduct of ethics. It was a structural requirement of an empire that needed every pair of hands and every herd of livestock to function as a single weaponized system. Genghis did not protect widows because he respected them. He protected them because a broken widow could not produce arrows, and an empire that runs out of arrows falls faster than any siege can kill. Layer in the second anomaly. The Yassa outlawed the enslavement of Mongols by other Mongols, a prohibition virtually unknown among contemporary civilizations. A freeborn Mongol could not be sold, traded, or taken as property by another Mongol, regardless of debt or crime. In practice, this meant that the thousands of prisoners taken at Urgench and elsewhere, men, women, children classified as spoils, were sourced exclusively from conquered populations. The legal protection was ethnically bounded. It was not universal. It was designed to preserve internal cohesion while maximizing external extraction. Trace that logic to its root. A Mongol woman who married a captured Persian artisan gained legal protection of her property. The artisan himself had none. His labor belonged to the state. But his children, born to the Mongol woman, would be free Mongols, covered by the Yassa's protections. The system was engineered for absorption. It was a demographic machine that took conquered populations, converted their labor into imperial wealth, and absorbed their offspring into the ruling class through the maternal line. The property rights of women were the linchpin of that machine. Without them, the children of mixed marriages would have fallen into stateless dependency, and the empire would have lost its ability to metabolize conquered peoples. So the widow's property rights were not a moral concession. They were a strategic gear in a machine designed for absorption. If that kind of structural insight is what you come here for, subscribe, so you do not miss the next episode where we trace how successor states shattered when they lost that calculus. Drop a comment with your take. Does knowing the cold logic behind the protection change how you view the empire, or does it make it harder to condemn? This is the part where the standard narrative of Mongol brutality and the standard narrative of Mongol legal sophistication collide into a single uncomfortable truth. They were never separate impulses. The same mind that designed the annihilation of entire urban populations also designed the legal framework that let a Mongol widow file a complaint against a neighbor who stole her sheep and win compensation. The brutality and the protection were outputs of the same optimization problem. Genghis Khan was solving for one variable: empire survival. Everything else, the death toll and the dowry rights, the massacre and the marriage contract, was a derivative of that single cold calculation. Pause here and measure the scale. The numbers come from the scholarly consensus on the Mongol death toll, which fluctuates between 20 and 40 million across the entire campaign era. In human terms, that is the equivalent of the entire population of the Roman Empire at its peak, reduced to zero. And yet within those same borders, a woman who owned livestock under the Yassa could appeal a theft charge before a judge, present witnesses, and recover her property 9 times out of 10 if the evidence held. The same empire that depopulated the Iranian plateau also ran courts that recorded property transfers for widows in the Mongolian heartland. What does that mean for the modern viewer? It means that the people we judge in history were not inconsistent. They were hyper-rational within their constraints. They did not see a contradiction between protecting a widow and destroying a city, because they did not categorize those acts under the same moral framework. The first was a logistical necessity. The second was a strategic tool. Both served the empire. Neither was a matter of right or wrong. And that is precisely what makes the Mongol Empire unsettling to study. It offers no clean lessons. It does not fit the archetype of the barbarian horde or the archetype of the enlightened ruler. It was an empire that solved its survival problems with terrifying effectiveness and left 40 million bodies behind as the cost of doing business. The Yassa was not a moral code. It was an operating manual. One door remains open. If the same optimization logic produced both the protection and the annihilation, then what happens when the optimization conditions change? The Mongol Empire did survive Genghis, but it did not survive the loss of the steppe traditions that shaped the Yassa. As the empire settled into conquered cities, as the Khans adopted the religions and legal systems of the people they governed, the cold rationality that once balanced protection and destruction began to erode. The widows kept their rights for a time. The cities kept falling for a time, but the system that held them together in tension eventually cracked. And what emerged was not a reformed empire, but a series of successor states that each had to relearn the calculus from scratch. The widows and the warriors, the herds and the siege towers, the Yassa's 47 lashes and its authorization of total urban destruction. These were not contradictions. They were two faces of a single machine, and the machine had only one goal: to keep itself in motion. When we separate the protection of women's rights from the military campaign, we impose a moral split that Genghis Khan never felt. He saw supply lines and demographic yield. He saw a widow's herd as a cavalry ration, a conquered artisan's child as a future soldier, and a city that resisted as a resource misallocation that had to be corrected. The question is not whether the Mongol Empire was brutal. It was, by any measure, among the most lethal political organizations in human history. The question is whether we can hold that fact in the same hand as the evidence that the same system extended property rights to women, criminalized the theft of livestock with meticulous procedural law, and settled inheritance disputes through courts that sometimes heard testimony from the women themselves. If we cannot hold both at once, we are not seeing the empire. We are seeing only the part of it that fits our assumption. The ability to hold two opposing truths in your mind at once is the mark of a serious student of history. If you are the kind of viewer who wants that fluency, who wants to be the person at the table who can explain why the Yassa Code matters, subscribe now and join a community that does not settle for half the story. In the comments, write the single word that you think best describes the Mongol Empire after watching this. Contradiction or optimization? I want to see which side you lean toward. The Yassa has not survived in a complete manuscript. What remains exists in fragments cited by Persian and Arab chroniclers who lived under Mongol rule, in the travel accounts of European envoys like Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck. and in the later legal compilations of the successor Khanates. No single document says, on the one hand, protect the widow, and on the other, burn the city. But the fragments together describe a system that did both without ever noticing the tension, because the tension existed only in the eye of the observer. Inside the machine, there was only the calculation. And that is the final lesson the Mongol Empire leaves behind. Every civilization runs on a set of assumptions it never examines. The Yassa's authors never asked whether women should have property rights. They asked whether the empire would be stronger or weaker if widows could not manage herds. The answer dictated the law. The morality was an afterthought, if it appeared at all. The same logic that killed 40 million was the same logic that guaranteed a woman in a felt tent the right to keep her sheep. When you read about any empire, Mongol, Roman, British, American, the question to ask is not whether its leaders were good or evil, or even whether its laws were just or unjust by today's standards. The question is what they were optimizing for. That single variable explains more than any amount of moral judgment ever will. The Mongol Empire optimized for survival and expansion. The women's property rights were a means. The massacres were a means. The entire apparatus was a means. And when the means stopped serving the end, the system abandoned them without sentiment. The steppe wind still blows over the graves of the Khans, unmarked by design, their locations deliberately lost. The herds still move across the grasslands. The felt gers still rise in the same valleys, where Mongol women once unrolled marriage contracts under the protection of a code that would, in the same generation, order the annihilation of cities it deemed inefficient. The tension between those two facts is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mirror held up to every civilization that has ever claimed to act out of principle, while calculating the cost of every life it did not count.